A very good morning to everyone. Welcome to the second day of the Asia Securities Forum. I'm not going to ask you if you had fun last night, because I know you did. We have proof that all of you were dancing. Okay. On this last day of the forum, we will have a busy schedule again, like yesterday. We now will start with the panels and try to be in line with the schedule, time-wise, until lunch. There will be a post-conference tour in the afternoon and dinner at night, but I will provide you with the administrative details after the sessions. Now, coming up is the first panel. Let me introduce you, our valuable panelists, and invite them to the stage, please. Mr. Catherine Edmondson, Secretary General, International Forum for Investor Education. Mr. Peter Eisenhardt, Secretary General, International Council of Securities Associations. Mr. Ian Russell, President and CEO, Investment Industry Association of Canada, and Mr. Pishet Siti Amnoy, Chairman, Association of Thai Securities Companies. The panel on this very current issue will be moderated by Mr. Albert Crespin, member of the TCMA Board of Auditors, President of CFA Istanbul Society, and the CEO of Deutsche Securities. Nice to see you again. Thank you so much for the panelists in advance, and please proceed. At the end of the panel, I'm going to ask the audience if you have any questions. So we have the microphone ready here.
I hope you hear me. Okay, good morning, everyone. Well, I've been to many conferences like this, and it's always, let's say, risky to talk on a panel, the first panel after the gala dinner. So you lose half of the people, and roughly...
At least.
So anyhow, thank you for coming and being here. Well, we have 4 distinguished guests with us now. The Master of Ceremony introduced them by their titles. Now I will straight go into the subject, the technology, its impact on capital markets, which is a very hot topic for many organizations globally. If I may, I'd like to ask the distinguished speakers to introduce themselves. That's going to be much quicker. Catherine, ladies first, if you can start by introducing yourself, then we can move in the row.
Most of you know me. I'm Catherine Edmondson. I am the Executive Director of the International Forum for Investor Education. We are focused on implementation activities. It's a global multi-sector organization of members working to implement programs and strategies. We see a continuum between financial education all the way through to investor education, so we work across the spectrum. And we always have a regional meeting of Asia IFI members adjacent to ASF, so thank you very much to all of you for your organizing and for your commitment to this area. And that's enough for now.
My name is Peter Eisenhardt. I'm a professional dancer, and I specialize in Middle Eastern dance, and if you need lessons, I can help. But thank you, Secretary General of ICSA. We're 19 associations. This is the first time we've had our interim meeting with ASF, so we're hugely grateful, and really thank you for having us participate.
Ian?
My name is Ian Russell, and I'm President and CEO.
The mic not working, I think.
My mic's not on.
Oh, gosh.
There we go.
Yeah.
Oh. Let me start again, and perhaps before I give my or introduce myself to you, I'll just again just echo what my colleagues have said and congratulate the Turkish Capital Markets Association for organizing such a stimulating business program. Yesterday was a great day, and I know today promises to be the same, and an outstanding social program. The first time I've been to an ASF conference, and it's certainly the right one to have started with. It's going to be hard to duplicate the effort in Istanbul this year. As I said a little earlier, my name is Ian Russell. I'm the President and Chief Executive of the Investment Industry Association in Canada, located in Toronto. It's an association that represents about 120 investment firms, registered investment firms across the country, large firms, small, institutional, retail. So it's a full cross-section of the capital markets. And we represent the interests of those members on securities regulation and on public policy. And as all of you know, it's been, the last 4 or 5 years have been a very intense effort with the ongoing regulatory reform. And Canada being a small country, obviously what's going on internationally has a big impact on the Canadian capital markets. So,
okay. Good morning. My name is Pichet Sitiamnoy. I'm the chairman of Association of Thai Securities Companies from Thailand. I just been elected to become the chairman just this past 2 months. And I also, actually, it's very interesting to pick on this topic because I also share the Information Technology Club of the association for 4 or 5 years. And for my normal job, I'm the president of the Bulong Securities Company, which is the part of Bangkok Bank, one of the largest banks in Thailand.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for this introduction. While the audience, please stay engaged and feel free. We are not a big group, so you can always step in with your questions as we start discussing. I'm sorry for that. We will try to make it as flowing as possible with conversations going on. There will be no presentation, so please feel free to step in. There is a combined more than a century of experience in capital markets, sitting here. I'm excluding myself. So, let's try to get the maximum out of this. So if I may, Ian, shall I give you the stage? Just maybe explain us, how technology is impacting the capital markets. Maybe you can start by drawing, a general framework.
As I was saying this morning, in thinking about this subject and topic, it's obviously a very complicated topic, and it's a continually changing and an innovative topic. And the focus of this panel discussion is really what kind of an impact is technology having on our industry, and what does it all mean, and where are capital markets going as a consequence? It's touching on all constituencies in the capital markets, certainly our members, our clients, and the regulators. I know in Canada we could never have made the kinds of dramatic changes in regulatory reform that we've seen without having the technology to handle all the compliance with those new rules. So I thought that, first of all, it's a formidable topic and wide-ranging, and we needed some kind of a focus here in order to have a discussion, and in particular an interactive discussion where we can draw your thoughts and experiences on technology. As I said, it permeates everything across the capital markets and everybody in the capital markets, but it has occurred with a different dynamic and change depending on the particular jurisdiction. Some of you are experiencing it faster than others, but inevitably it's going to catch up and affect everybody in the marketplace. So I thought that in approaching this topic, that it would be interesting to look at it from the prism of different themes. And by doing that, it would focus and channel the discussion. Obviously, we're not going to cover everything that everybody wants to, but it will enable us to at least try to keep a a fairly straightforward discussion as we move forward. And so in talking about those themes, and then I'm just going to mention about 3 or 4 that I see as the most important themes around technology and how capital markets have changed, looking at it through that particular lens, and then my colleagues can build out on it. When I talk about these themes, it will immediately come, you'll understand what I'm saying. So the first and most important one to me is access. This is what technology has done, is it's provided incredible access to the capital markets for investors, particularly retail investors and small investors that heretofore didn't have the economics to justify much in the way of advice or the distribution of products. Technology has enabled a much wider distribution, not just of products and products, but in terms of advice. And a lot of these products and advice are being provided online. So that's led to the real democratization, I think, of our capital markets. The second way that access has been important is access to information. It used to be that there was a huge asymmetry of information. Sophisticated investors in the marketplace often had access to information more quickly and broader access to information than other investors. Through technology, there's a much greater equivalence of access across all investors, which has led to more efficient capital markets and a broader participation in the markets, which I think is healthy overall. A couple of the other areas that have changed dramatically, without getting into much detail here, is market efficiencies, both because of the back office technology in terms of the processing of transactions and trading, and efficiencies in terms of in the front office in trading markets, algo trading, addressing arbitrage opportunities in the market. So all of it leading to more efficient capital markets. The speed and cost of transactions, both in equity markets and debt markets, because of electronic trading platforms in particular, we can access, there's greater transparency of prices, and there's the ability to access those prices quickly and at lower cost. And that is not just in the institutional markets, but if you look in Canada, online trading now is at zero cost to the consumer. Capital raising has changed because of electronic dissemination of information quite dramatically. I think convenience plays a really important role in the capital markets for retail investors. You can access your account, market information, you can trade through mobile devices. So suffice to say that technology has really provided a great deal of convenience for investors across the board, whether they're retail or institutional, to participate in the capital markets. And I guess finally, or almost finally, investment products themselves, through the innovation of products, often derivative types of products using technology, ETFs, which has become really the most popular investment product in the retail market in most markets around the world, but other derivatives as well that have enabled more efficient portfolio making and hedging opportunities in the capital markets. And finally, the negatives, I think, with technology are the obvious one of cyber risks that have heightened in the market because of technology. I think the other one would be market volatility. There is the potential for much more market volatility as a consequence of technology, and we can get into those risks as we move forward. And the final risk, which is a new one that's emerging on the horizon, is personal information. I mean, personal information is now the most desired commodity in the capital markets, to be able to understand the profile of the client and provide the kind of necessary advice. But what it comes with is an obligation to be able to transfer and port that information within the financial sector, and also the requirement to maintain the confidentiality of all of that information. That provides a big cost burden on the industry and a huge liability, as well as opportunity. So those are the broad themes, and I thought that we could start there, and I'm sure my colleagues will have different perspectives on those questions. I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Well, that's a really good framework to start with. Of course, when you start with your, the technological developments progress, there is also some negative side to it that I'm sure we're going to discuss. Peter, maybe if I give the stage to you just to talk about this market efficiency, eliminating arbitrage, and speed of execution. How maybe you can build on it a little bit. And in terms of democratization of finance, is it really the case? I really want to elaborate it, or is there a group of investors or a group of firms that can be leading the way and the rest, in a way, staying behind?
I think there's quite a back and forth as to whether finance gets democratized or whether the larger players take back the advantage and the lead. I thought it was quite interesting in the early 2000s with the internet. It used to be that at a big trading firm, it cost something like $350,000 for someone to sit down every day in terms of all the screens and the technologies that they were provided. And then we shifted to a world where you could replicate 95% of that just by having the internet and having a PC. I think we moved into a stage then where I think we really had that influential book, Flash Boys, where we realized that those who could spend a bit more on technology could develop systems where they could communicate with exchanges nanoseconds quicker and thus have a big advantage. There's been a constant debate about this and what's fair play, but I think we do know that at each step of the way, technology has made things better for everybody. Even if an investor were to complain about the advantages that the big players have, they're still paying, as Ian said, now almost nothing on commission. They've got huge amounts of information. I think regulators will continue to have their eye on this just to be sure that that balance is right, that the bigger players who are investing in technology and making markets faster and more efficient will get a return, but on the other hand, they won't have too great an advantage compared to the retail investor.
Yeah, and Piche, maybe you mentioned about your technology. Yeah,
actually, like to touch on that point too, because that what happened in Thailand, that we have seen a lot of new technology coming in for those algo trading, and of course, those institutions will take advantage on that because of the high budget that they have. And what happens is that it feels like the retail investors now become less competitive, and you can see that all those big guns can run all those programs. And also, it's very interesting that during the past few years, I would say that early on, I mean, everybody feels like Thailand is a retail market, right? And just about a year ago, the retail portion trading reduced from more than 50% to about 35% because of those algo that come from institutions, both international and local, like jump in. And that's what happened in the past 12 months, right? So, yeah, it's right that the technology really leads the trading, but now the retail also have to catch up. And we see that a lot of retail brokers now have to develop all those new algo trading to compete with those big firms.
So the algo tradings, which is made, the systems which are made available to retail investors. That's
exactly,
right.
Yes.
And Catherine, maybe you can touch upon from the investor or the retail investor, the mass investor on the street, where they sit here in terms of do they really feel the benefits? Well, Piche mentioned a little bit about, they're a bit laggard in that sense, but let me put it this way. When we talk about investor education, we have, different courses, different credentialing programs like CFA, etc. but maybe investors now need to be aware of this new technology and how it impacts the markets, which is not in the curriculum in general. Maybe should investor education also include that sort of algos, that are being employed in the market so that they're aware of what's going on. Or in general, I really want you, to provide some view on whether investors at large are utilizing technology and whether they have access to this new sort of information, if you like algos, how they trade, etc. If you can comment on that a little bit.
Small question. Hey, at least the
Okay,
room's full.
You pick whatever you like and you can answer that.
A couple things. I think it's great that Ian sort of laid out the role of technology because that's a great place to start and it's a positive way to think about it. I think most of you who were in the room yesterday from our investor and country reports know that the levels of literacy, of ability, of capacity in countries are different. And within a country, they're different as well. They also tend to differ, at least to some degree, in how, say, a small growth and emerging market approaches their economy and market versus a large growth and emerging market. And then there's sort of the advanced gem split. So as most of you know, IOSCO had just asked IFIE to come to their growth and emerging market annual meeting to provide the 120 countries or market people some discussion about these issues. And there are plenty of splits everywhere in what to do next and what to think about. I think Ian's right on the cybersecurity issue. We try to gather intel throughout the system. So, for example, where you have ombudsman schemes, you're starting to see some of this crop up. But a lot of people do not understand the cybersecurity issues. They don't know how to manage their information online. They don't think about the privacy and data issues. So I think the cybersecurity piece is going to be a real challenge. And the regulators and all of you and everybody are going to have to think about this every time you start putting products or services or expect individuals to handle things online. The second thing is that one of the interesting pieces of the mobile technology that we're starting to hear people finally admit after 7 or 8 years is that, as someone said, the bad people have followed the good people onto mobile technology. So this whole fraud area is much more recognized now, I would say, than it was a few years ago, and it's clearly a worry. So some of these countries that have depended on bypassing some of that technology have started to really be concerned about that.
Well, for example, a quick question there. How can an individual investor distinguish an app being a computer game and it really has access to the real market? It's a big question to me, especially in OTC markets. There are concerns about that, whether the prices are right, because those millisecond, microsecond delays, etc., immediately makes that app, a mock app, if you like.
But you have to start, I think we are going to have to worry about not just investor education, we're going to have to, there is a real tension between, and worry, and I would say it's getting more so about how do we make sure young people have the practice they need, and then when they're leaving school, so they're entering the workforce, both needing to know technology to be employable, but also needing to understand it to be responsible, and then you've got that sort of cohort at the end of life where people are worried about whether there's going to be enough money, whether people can manage pensions and insurance, and whether they have cognitive skills. So part of that answer is going to be starting so that people do recognize the differences and start developing that behavior early. But then your point is well taken that, and experiential learning is very helpful there, but it's not enough.
True, yeah, I agree. Well, that's really, I don't really want to concentrate on the negatives, but maybe we can elaborate more. For example, Ian, I really want to direct this to you. So access to information has this flip side of access to misinformation. So if you have a system which has some, let's say, inherent flaws, with technology, you will amplify that, garbage in, garbage out. How, do you see how that can be managed? Market manipulation through technology. I'm not only suggesting using algos to manipulate, but also using Twitter to manipulate. I don't want to go this into a political debate, but I want to stick to finance. And maybe after that, Peter, you can also, or you both can comment whether regulators are ready or, market participants are ready to, regulate that or let's say to eliminate that.
Okay, well, I'll start that. I think that's always a potential for market manipulation or a potential for poor information or bad information that comes into the marketplace, and the issue is how do you deal with it? And I guess there are, in terms of the market manipulation question that you refer to, the control there is really the market surveillance that is undertaken, again, using a lot of technology by the regulator to ensure that that kind of manipulation is stamped out or not permitted in the marketplace. The other thing that is important is there's huge amounts of information. Some of it is relevant to investors. Some of it is not relevant, even though it may be accurate. And the question is, what's the appropriate filter, especially for the retail investor, on information and its importance or its accuracy? And I think one of the things that's key in terms of the retail part of the marketplace is that this goes hand in hand with advice and a trained advisor to help guide decisions taken by investors. So first of all, there are these regulatory controls over the marketplace itself, and then there are regulatory controls over the advice of the client. That doesn't eliminate problems across the board, but I think it's probably a positive.
Peter?
Yeah, I think the principle that the regulators have is if you're going to create a cyber trader on your desk instead of a person, you have to program that trader to do all the same things within the right rules. And you can't, well, a friend of mine at a large bank said that he saw it within his firm. He was a senior manager, and he said he saw a program being developed which had spoofing incorporated into this electronic model, and he immediately had that taken out. And regulators have the principle that you've got to obey by the same rules, and you're just as responsible. And if you program some artificial intelligence trader, it's got to be doing the right things, and you're responsible if it all goes wrong. So I think that's a really important one. I think on the question, are regulators keeping up? Well, they're trying their very best. We see how fast the world is moving. They're creating all sorts of networks among themselves as a place to start. They're finding areas of expertise, countries that are a little bit ahead of one area relative to the other. They're writing all sorts of papers on that. They're moving towards trying to create some common standards around the world. But again, all this is very difficult, and we're in a very fast-moving space.
So do you see the regulators hiring, top-notch graduates, PhDs, etc.? That's one question. Maybe it could be some sort of an indication of how regulators are keeping up. The other one is, maybe AIs should have a responsible and accountable human intelligence behind it. So then maybe you have some skin in the game as the person. You can maybe manage that, at least, keep someone accountable and responsible for that. So there is some sort of a, cycle that humans also control that behavior.
Well, I think, just on that point, in the Canadian context, if you're, and that's starting to happen, you're seeing these AI systems develop with institutions. But if they put trading mechanisms in place that are sort of algo data analytic systems, there's an ultimate responsibility by the registrant, which is the firm behind it, Albert, so that there are controls in terms of ensuring that if they're going to implement that technology, it's got to be in the context of what the rules are.
Okay.
One point that I wanted to raise that was connected to what we said a little bit before, which we haven't quite touched on with technology, it's a huge investment. It's which is an obvious thing. Very, very expensive for firms to put in place technology. Even if it's there, can they afford to do it? And is one of the unintended consequences here that some firms just can't keep up with implementing state-of-the-art technology, so those investors get disenfranchised? I mean, that's an interesting question, and I just wanted to make a point because others here may have had a similar experience in their markets. But in Canada, and it's also the case in the United States, what happens is that the builders of the technology, whether it's order management systems at the front end, or whether it's back office processing systems to meet transactional needs or regulatory compliance, those vendors build for the whole market. So when rules change, in particular, for example, or markets change and there's a demand, they build for the whole market. So they work together as almost a cooperative, and that doesn't eliminate costs in any way, but it mitigates the increase in costs because they spread that out across an industry and enables smaller firms to be able to implement.
So that also implies the smaller firms have the option to buy the minimum package, the minimum facility at a reasonable cost. So, right, you know, that
Yeah, and the other option that happens in markets is that those small firms have the option of piggybacking, if you will, as an introducer firm on top of a carrying broker.
Actually, can I touch on that? Because
Yes, and
I don't think that the regulator can like beef up all those technology right away. But from what I see, what they're doing is that they try to collaborate with other agencies, for example, like cyber police or like the stock exchange itself, to make sure that they can catch up with the game. Because all those guys, they move very fast, right? And I mean, the regulators cannot just like, okay, we'll invest like billions in it. There's no budget, right? So they need to move. They need to work closely with other guys, including us, right? So they have to make sure that they can catch it fast, but with minimum budget that they have, right? That's all they can do. And on this kind of thing, actually, back to the cybersecurity thing, what happened is that the regulator in Thailand tried to work together with all the stakeholders in the industry. For example, like the Stock Exchange of Thailand, they know that who's the weakest link in this thing? Actually, it's the broker. So they have to come up with a club deal so that they can make sure that we are better, we can harden our IT security instead of letting us go loose, because each company has different budget, right? So big companies, of course, can put as much as we can, but smaller brokers, they have very limited budget. So the stock exchange come up with the scheme to do the pen test whatsoever, so that we can beef up our IT security. On the other side, the Thai Security Exchange Commission, they are working together with us now to do this cyber exercise, like a tabletop exercise. We're doing it right now, actually, in 2 weeks, to make sure that all the participants, including brokers, including AMCs, even like those smaller advisory firms, to make sure that we can react to any kind of threat that's coming in terms of process. At least we know how, right? I mean, of course, we cannot protect everything now, but it's the way to respond, how to respond to those IT attacks, how to make sure that everybody in the industry understand, and make sure that whatever happens, we can eliminate or reduce the impact as much as we can.
I think what we're seeing in the investor education, financial education space on the regulatory side is that the roles of the different regulatory institutions are changing. So particularly the central bank, the definitions of financial inclusion, although it's, you have to be careful when you say this, I think the definitions of financial inclusion are changing, and when people use that term, they mean something different. It is going to be more and more critical to make sure that the regulators, whether they're super regulators or central banks or securities regulators, actually try to work together. And I think they know that. The other piece, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that, at least we're seeing in the space that I'm in, is that this whole question of bank regulation versus capital market regulation versus pensions, insurance, and all that, if there is some awareness waking up in various parts of the world that they're going to all have to work together, that some of these things affect both the institutional markets and are more critical than ever. So I think that's that second piece. More and more, there's an awareness on the part of the regulators as well as the players in the markets that all of those pieces are relevant, and that has not always been the case. So that's also an interesting piece of what's going on. And then the third thing I would say is that at least some regulators, particularly in Asia, have been trying to do the sandbox effort to try and test things out. That's a change. I don't know how much the regulators can sort of really bank on that, so to speak, but they sure are thinking that that's helpful. And that's definitely new. It's like, okay, we don't know what we're doing, but we'll put it in a sandbox if we can get that. We don't know the aspects and nobody else does either. Now, again, this is my part of the universe, not yours, but it seems to me that's one of the ways that people who recognize things are changing so fast and they're behind and they've still got these other systems. So that volatility piece is really forcing them to think about what else to do.
And in the sandbox, the innovator is getting some regulatory relief as it's. How do you feel about that?
So you first do, then you apologize. Otherwise, then you try to regulate. Let me put it that way. So.
But you also test things that they don't seem to feel there are other ways to test.
Yeah.
And so the best thing, maybe AI is a good place for a sandbox.
Except with sandboxes, there's obviously a positive, which is it's a way of, as Catherine was saying, it's a way to test new fintech in sort of a controlled environment, if you will.
But real life, controlled real life environment.
But the negative side of that is that some of that fintech are direct competitors with regulated entities. So once they get inside that sandbox, they've got the playing field isn't level in certain areas, and you can imagine things like robo-investing and whatever. Now again, if it's straight vanilla robo-investing, maybe that falls within a regulatory definition, so it's not a problem. But at one point, it was a problem. So regulators just have to discriminate very carefully about what they're putting inside these sandboxes.
And Ian, the other side of that is that individuals don't necessarily understand those distinctions.
No.
So what happens, what we're seeing on the ombudsman side, some of the complaints that are coming from consumers, is that they miss that if they shift from, say, a bank to something online that's not regulated, and they get defrauded, and they lose all their money, and then they go back to the banking system, which is largely hidden and covered a lot of that, right, that expense. There's no money there. And so some of the dimensions of dealing with technology is also invisible to the people who get impacted, and there's no backup for that. So it's a real issue. And it's not, I don't mean it for the sandbox piece, because I'm not making a judgment on that. But there is that reality about regulated versus unregulated. So when you move from one place to another,
the
it can
thing
be a
that's
real problem.
putting the regulators to death, I think, well, certainly in the Canadian context, is that you have internet platforms in the dark web. So they're not located in Canada or the particular jurisdiction at all.
Sure. No, that's
and
right.
those are trading platforms. They could be foreign exchange. They could be crypto, Bitcoin, whatever. They're not regulated. Bitcoin trading isn't even allowed in Canada, and yet it goes on. And there was a huge scandal in the Canadian marketplace about huge amounts of money that were taken in by an exchange that wasn't regulated. So it's an issue of how do you get your hands around that when it's not even in the regime, and yet in the regulatory regime, and yet it's investors can access it. So that's a very valid point.
Yeah, you very much have the cross-border issues. I remember one panel, someone saying, gosh, if I'm a bad guy and I'm in a faraway jurisdiction and I start trying to get people to trade through my platform in another country, I may not get any money on a given day, but I'm probably not going to get in trouble either. So it seems to be a low-risk venture.
Yeah, so that leads to the need for a global, universal, let's say, regulation, as Catherine maybe mentioned, or at least while interaction may not be enough, you need to take quick action, etc. But I want to take one of the points that you made. It was something that I wanted to come. So you said the technology firms yes, they may become competition to regulated entities, which is good. But now this comes, maybe Piche, I'll start from you. So you've been silent for a while.
Not for that long.
You can start responding to that. So a regulated entity by definition, is you define a rent, you define a benefit and, subject to meeting certain conditions, banks can, do fractional banking, brokers can access to the market, etc. But what is the value add? Can regulated entities continue to be that way? They are regulated fine, but they don't add any value add to the consumers in general.
I think what they are trying to do now also it's a catch-up game with the technology itself, because they understand, but how can they move into the new way of thinking to catch up with the technology that allow more new products, more new way of investing, and I think sometimes they kind of doubt themselves that should they go or they don't go, right? They're not sure that if the new product with the new technology will work with the market. And it's very funny that in Thailand, we have been asking them to follow, or to come up with the new rules, for example, like social trading, copy trade. And imagine, we went to see them 3-4 years ago. They feel oh, it's very risky, don't do that. And then when the fintech company come and talk to them and said, oh, it's a good idea. It's how come?
So there is the risk that the regulator entity has some protection, like it's an oligopolistic setup, if you like. I'm talking about the all capital markets institutions in general. So you have the fintech coming in, finding a solution, a superior one, because, well, I don't know, what is the value add of having the ATM machine? I'm talking about the banking sector now. If we start using electronic money, I'm not talking about crypto money, electronic money, then why, as a consumer, I should pay for that ATM machine's cost? Because in the system, it's a big cost, right? So, well, from my perspective, it's clearly more efficient. Well, of course, there must be rules to let those technology companies to sneak in and, try to avoid the regulated entities to become prohibitive of that technology to grow. I don't know what you think about that. Well, of course, please also, as you provide your comments, if you can look from the jobs angle, how this transformation can happen, and, as the value add goes down, provided by the regulated entities, what's going to happen? Are we going to see a consolidated, I don't know, as we're talking about the regulatory side, maybe the exchanges will become the sole marketplace, so the brokers will be, irrelevant, because you don't need the brokers, as long as exchange can handle.
Actually, that's a $1 billion question. Yeah, because, people feel should we have a broker, right?
Yeah, but similarly, you can ask, if you have the distributed ledger technology, should we have the exchanges, right?
Right.
Or if we have the Bitcoin, again, distributed ledger, if we
digital
can
asset, actually.
sort the problem of trust, then do we really need the regulators? That's I'm just trying to push it to some extremes, but I really wonder that regulated entity, value added provided by them, it brings some complacency, because the regulated entities in a way hide behind some sort of a rule set, which may not be, up to date, or let's say fitting to today's world.
I think the regulator themselves, they understand how the market becomes now, and all those questions that you have been talking about, they realize all those, but they haven't come up with a real decision-making process of what will be the future of the capital markets as a whole. They know that if we use all the technology and come up with those new kind of exchange, of course, all of us are in the intermediary we eliminate anyway, right? But how also they have to also treat us in a way that they don't destroy the whole industry, right? In a way that they can make sure that investors can invest in the most efficient way. So I think they still don't know how or don't know the real answer for that, and I think they're still working on it.
Yeah.
Well, you have two things working in tandem. First of all, you have the marketplace itself, which is demanding high standards of efficiency and service and low cost. And you have a regulator, and the regulator has an obligation to ensure that there is a standard of investor protection. But that regulator should not interfere with innovation and progress and change. And it's a bit of a balance, but if you have old line brokers that are regulated, they shouldn't be able to hide behind that to avoid making the changes that the marketplace demands. And on the other hand, these fintech players, they should be able to offer their services and compete for business as long as if they're serving the public, then they have to be equivalent to the same standards. Now, those standards may be less simply because the line of business they cover is less. But just on that one point alone, one of the things that was a false notion that was raised in the Canadian market is that somehow robo-investing was going to replace advice. And I think a lot of these robo players entered the market under that assumption and were offering a pure technology service, and it was fine. It was acceptable. It had a level of regulatory standard, but it didn't offer advice. But the marketplace wanted advice, and so what you've had is an interesting phenomenon. You've had advice actually move and migrate onto online platforms. But the other thing that's very interesting, again, is the marketplace at work in a regulatory framework, is these robo-advisors, robo-investors in the Canadian marketplace and in the U.S. marketplace have actually set up technology operations to service conventional brokers that didn't have the technology. So now they're providing the technology to meet the demand, lower the costs, give what the consumer wants. So as long as you've got a consistency in the investor protection standard. You've had that experience?
That happened a lot, I think, not only in Thailand, but I think in other countries too, because fintech, they have good ideas. They have good product. They don't have customer base. So that's why we see lots of cases that fintech have to work together with brokers who have a lot, like large client base, right? So that they can work together and giving the investors the best product they should have.
And I think the other dimension, I mean, this is the most important argument for discussion for this room, but I think the other piece of this is that human beings don't necessarily behave the way everybody wants them to, and particularly when there's a gap or when they get burned or they get afraid, and they pull out or they change their behavior or they fight you. They're not going to a robo-advisor. They're going to need a human being. The volatility of the markets that Ian was talking about is very real. We've been looking at some of people's behavior when markets sort of do things, and people's behavior changes, and so when they leave and then they come back in, it's very different in cases. And so I think there's this other set of financial resiliency issues that we're going to have to get used to, which is that these changes are going to be huge for the market side and the regulatory side, but people are going to have to be more resilient. They're going to have to understand. Think about climate change. People are probably going to have to rebuild multiple times during their lifetime. They're going to have to be more resilient, and we're all going to have to help people do that. It's not going to happen, just by sort of saying so or hoping that we can get through it. So I think that volatility piece and how individuals think about risk, the risk challenges right now are not just in the markets and the regulatory structure. Risk education for individuals is going to be really different, much more complicated, I think.
Okay, and how about, Peter, maybe you were going to say something, but maybe let me ask this question. How about jobs? Let's talk about a little bit into the future, if we can. Well, maybe a brief background from our previous discussion before the panel. I'm an equities guy, and, there are a lot of bond market experience here. and I've seen in my own, short life how the trading floor has changed over the years, how banks have adopted. And these are all, I would say, inferior technology. It's just, market access or whatever. Some jobs that used to be quite value added in the past, like, sales trader role or a salesman role, etc., they're all dying, with going into passive. The question is how the jobs will going to change. How do you think the investment management, or let's say in general, capital markets will look like? That's one. The second is with the technology, in terms of access to capital. We all discussed about trading and everything. Will it help access to capital? That's the second one. And well, let me stop here. And Peter, maybe I can start with you.
Yeah, I think ever since they invented this thing called the internet, if you're a middleman, you're scared. You have to worry about being disintermediated for sure. So you have to find some new ways to add value. And I think in terms of a big capital markets institution, it's going to be about relationships, and it's going to be about advice. The pace of technological change and disintermediation is unrelenting. In Europe, we have this new project by the European Central Bank called EDI, which is the idea of making a bond platform that goes from pre-issuance to post-issuance. It goes all the way from the initial creation of the bond and the book building and the issuance straight through to the settlement. And that would be a major change, but you could argue that that's a real efficiency as well, because it would be one common straight-through process. I think on the retail side, I was at one of Ian's seminars, and because of all this technology, on the retail side, people were saying that financial advisors might become more like a coach, a life coach, with maybe robo making a lot of the financial decisions, and you're executing online. You might just want to have someone saying, wagging a finger at you all the time saying, are you saving enough, and do you have a proper budget? Which is not unlike the way we were probably 30 or 40 years ago with the family bank manager in the UK, who would, you'd go in his office and he'd tell you whether you were allowed to go on vacation this year or not. So we're going to have to find ways to add value.
Yeah. Well, just being aware of time, maybe shall I turn to the audience? Any questions from the audience? Okay, so there are several. Let's start with this gentleman at the front, please. Yeah. Here.
Oh, thank you very much. And this has been a fantastic session. It's really a lot of very good information coming through. I had a rather specific question. During the discussion, Catherine, you mentioned that quite a degree of differentiation across jurisdictions here, but also within countries in terms of financial literacy and the like. And when you talk about questions of technology, there's particular issues which present to the older part of our populations because they're not as open to new technologies or aware of it. I'm just interested in maybe some comments from the panel about how technology might help address this issue of people who are growing older and may not have all of the capabilities they had as younger people in terms of their capability to manage their financial affairs. Thank you.
That's a good question. Maybe we need some other technology like biotech, to really reverse, I don't know, dementia or amnesia, so that to make, older people younger. Well, but I'm just, so if you want to pick that up.
First of all, there is no one clear answer yet, as Japan, JSDA can tell you for sure. But it is a worldwide increasing awareness that whether you're in cognitive decline or not, as the world changes, you just become, as you age, you sometimes become just less able to handle things. So if you're a widow in a rural area without as much access or without a lot of people around to help you, you're going to have problems, even if you're cognitively still, feeling or acting like you're 25. So a couple of things. First of all, there are increasing numbers of participants in the markets and in the ASF member context who are looking at certifications for special professionals to understand how to deal with cognitive declines. The banking system in general, I think, has been thinking about it, but the workforce and some of the certification programs for brokers have started putting special certifications and then figuring out, who should have them, where they should be required, and how to deal with that. So that's one. There are some national jurisdictions that are also thinking, and again, I'm telling you, I'm not advocating one way or the other, but some jurisdictions are also thinking about, guardianship systems or other kinds of trustee systems and really re-looking at that whole area. That gets into a whole nother set of sort of human relations and dynamics and legal trusts and all sorts of other things. So, it doesn't make the LIBOR issue look easy, but that one is very complicated. The other thing which I think is important, two other things I think is important. Number one, you saw very distinctively yesterday that in different countries, the amount of wealth is owned by different generations or different age cohorts. That also matters a lot, right? It matters because if most of the wealth is being held by over 60, say, there was one graph yesterday, versus it's a young population, that's just not true or whatever, that's going to change how you have to think about that in a very different context. And I think the final thing that I'm seeing more, and I mentioned it earlier in another context, is that I think people are sort of waking up to stakeholders, opinion leaders. You guys are starting to think about the pension and insurance piece as well. So you're starting to sort of build in some of these also anticipation worries for your public policy systems and countries about how you're just going to pay for people who are living to be 100 now when they were not able to save enough. So that's also, in my opinion, that's changing the way the markets are thinking too. It may not be good or bad, but you can definitely see it starting to creep into some of the discussions. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to David's question because it's a hugely important one if you think about it. I mean, what everybody's now focused on is this aging investor and the vulnerabilities of that particular client, both because of physical decline and just general limits on financial literacy. And what technology does is it offers devices and services that give full discretion to the investor. So we talk a lot about the need for an advisor to stay alert to a client and the deterioration of his physical health or her physical health, be alert to sudden changes in their portfolio that they're asking for. Because there's a number of egregious examples that are coming forward by people who even have a power of attorney who are taking advantage of that client. So that's all something that has to be dealt with, and there are the development of best standards and best principles. But if you're operating on a fully discretionary basis on an electronic platform, the risks that are out there for the client are quite enormous. Yeah. So I don't think we've really got the answer. I don't know whether there's been much work in Japan with Koichi Ishiguro because that's obviously something they've been focused on, but those are great concerns.
Well, we had several, I think that lady, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Albert. My question will be, okay, I'll stand up because I'm so small. Okay, the world is changing, right? I mean, we will all agree to that. We talk about cross-border, but to me it's like, with the advance of technology, it's like really borderless, we can access almost everything at the tip of our finger, right? So now my question is really related to the future of securities companies. Yeah, now that with the advance of fintech, everything is so efficient, so fast, right? So cheap. Unlike with the securities company, like it takes time, and it's like inefficient, and then it's not that fast. KYC, everything. Yeah. So even our regulators say that securities company, actually we don't need that. It's like so inefficient. So it's like the statement is, it's like protected inefficiency. It's like you are so inefficient, but I want you to exist, so I protect you with regulation. Yeah, because otherwise you cannot compete. You cannot compete with the fintech company. You know, like they can just freely and then very easily meet demand and supply. We have been having this forum for like 1995. So will we be having for how many years more? Yeah. I mean, you know, I'm very interested to know. I mean, this is a very serious question because this is our survivor, our existence. You know, like securities companies, zero commission, everything. It's really changing. Yeah, the landscape is really changing. Yeah. So, yeah, if you can share your opinion, thank you.
Yeah, and very briefly, please.
Yeah, but
otherwise the master of ceremony will kick us out. I think we're running out of.
Want me to start?
No, the master. Well, you can start. Well, if you want.
I just disagree on that. Regulator protecting us. Actually, they have to protect the investors, right? So that I agree with Ian that. So the level playing field has to be the same among us and among the fintech companies. So that's the main key. We have to make sure that the regulators. You treat us same the way that you treat a fintech.
Yeah. Why not deregulate us?
Yeah.
You know, if they can operate without it, why can't we?
Yeah.
I think. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think the last point is, how many people in the world today have ever seen a bear market? And what if we have a bear market? And, you know, our securities firms are going to be important, and we play a role as market maker. And I don't think people can ever forget that. So I think we have a reason to live.
I think the other point here, too, is that, you know, it's well and good to talk about how you want access to something that's fast and efficient and quick and has these benefits. But one of the things that's coming to light is investors are really intelligent at the end of the day, and they recognize that, yeah, sure, they want to have that capability, but what they also want in their financial life is they want somebody to guide them. That is increasingly evident, and I think Catherine can probably speak to that. Survey after survey, and just looking at the marketplace, is advice is hugely valued. Peter said it well. We're looking for a life coach to help guide us with financial decision-making as we move through the various stages of our life and take advantage of these things like speed, efficiency, quickness, however you want to articulate it. But at the end of the day, we want to accomplish our life goals, and I think most investors recognize that you really need good advice to do that.
Catherine, you want to add anything? I will close otherwise. No.
You've got like 5 hands in there. So.
Yeah, actually, well, can I take that last question? Where is the master of ceremony? Okay. So do we have 2 more minutes?
Flexible one.
Okay, thank you very much.
It's an interesting panel.
Oh, that will be the last one, please. Yeah. And if you quickly ask your question.
I'm wearing different hats, just to excuse myself. I'm sitting at the board of the Thai Stock Exchange. So I think different countries have different structure and environment. In Thailand, as Vijay just said, we have regulator as SEC. We have the stock exchange, which is not demutualized, still mutualized. So the way that what we see, the regulator look at it, it's just as Vijay mentioned earlier, they protect the investor. The thing is, when they look from the market itself, one concern is they need to make sure there's a fairness on the trading. So technology come very long time ago on the trading platform, electronic. And then through time, when you have a combination of the mix of the institutional investor and retail, for Thailand as used to be dominated by retail, getting reduced because it makes more sense to me that basically small investors with the literacy that they have, they got burned easily. They rather go and putting money in the institutional investor. And then we have the institutional investor who hire the broker to do the execution. And through time, we allow DMA, which is also another technology, to to overcome the trading.
Can I request to come to your question?
Yeah, no,
Please,
yeah. What
Just,
I'm
yeah.
surprised that when we see the development and through different platforms in the world, we seem to look at it as a threat. Instead of looking at it, it's a changing behavioral. When instead of embracing it, we look at it in a different way. Of course, in Thailand, 40 brokers. Some are retail dominated, some are institution. They have conflict already. So when you allow robo coming in, the other side will get hurt. But people who develop all this basically improve the market efficiency. So I see complaint and I see that people tend to have something that they worry about. And you imagine when there are more and more of this kind of technology trading, they balance themselves. So they just nobody will eventually get the benefit out of it, but it's stabilized. We have seen, I think, in Singapore, when they allow a lot of this thing, they move away because the margin of this kind of advantage become thinner. So my question is, it seems like different environment, different player, different perspective will have an issue. But actually, if you allow it to continue by itself, it will solve and it's balancing itself.
Well, I'll just take a shot at it. I mean, there are different structures in the marketplace in the various countries, and you mentioned even in Thailand alone, it was a demutualized, or you have a non-demutualized stock exchange. And in that kind of a model, as a case in point, you had a regulator that was a part of the stock exchange because it was a utility in effect. And that's fine because the conflicts are properly addressed there. There's no profit motive, so there's nobody taking advantage of a conflict of interest between offering trading and then having regulation. But as soon as you do mutualize and you create a for-profit stock exchange, you don't want to be regulating yourself. So the regulation moved independently. And that's what happened in Canada. So the conflict that was obviously created by the change in structure is addressed by moving the regulator outside the stock exchange. So my answer is that I think regulators have to be attuned to conflicts that arise in different structures and then either eliminate them or properly regulate them.
And I'm sorry, just one thing. I understand what you're saying. I think the place where you will see that some of what you're saying is not totally true is just looking at countries, economies, and markets that have been hit by climate change, for example. You know, some things do change, and they sort of stay changed. So you may be right that over time everything sort of works itself out. But my experience in the stuff that we've been doing after natural disasters is not so much. You know, things change pretty much permanently.
Okay, if I may, I need to cut here. I'm sorry for that, but you can ask questions, in the break. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, the panelists, it was lovely, and thanks for sharing your views. And I wish you, a good day and, fruitful discussions in the coming panels. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very interesting
Worked out.
and stimulating panel. And if you have further questions, as Albert said, you can just find them during the coffee break. And now we need to continue with our second panel, which is about the capital markets' role in reaching SDGs. Ian, I think you should stay here. You're still a panelist in the second one. So I would like to welcome Mr. Koichi Isikura, Chief Officer for International Affairs Research, Japan Securities Dealers Association, Mr. Mushtaq Kapasi, Managing Director and Chief Representative of Asia Pacific, ICMA, and Mr. Ian Russell is already here. You know that he's the President and CEO of the Investment Industry Association of Canada, and Mr. Kamlesh Shroff from the Association of National Exchanges Members of India. The panel will be moderated by Mr. Selim Yazıcı, who is the Chairman of the Turkish Institutional Investment Managers Association. Mr. Yazıcı, please, let's try to stay within the limits. I mean, you have 5 minutes more because the others finished a little bit later. So instead of 11, you may target to finish around 11:05. Thank you. You know, in order to be in line with the schedule and to save some time, I'd like to remind you that after this panel, we're going to have a photo session on the stage. So I'll just skip reminding it once again. Please be ready after the panel on the stage for a photo shoot. Thank you. And after the photo shoot, we're going to have a coffee break for 15 minutes.
The actual, what's the actual impact of the financial investments and how you optimize?
Good morning. Welcome again. I hope everyone is enjoying their stay in Istanbul. I've had chat with some of you, and I know that some of you have been here many times before, like Koichi. So digitalization and maybe sustainability are the two hot topics in the financial industry. I am someone from the buy side, and this is definitely a big issue for us on the buy side. So I think this panel will give me some opportunity to spy a bit about the issues on the sell side on sustainability. Let me give you a brief info about where we are in sustainability in Turkey. Definitely, it's not on the top of the agenda for us, not on the agenda of clients, definitely not companies and the government. Of course, there are some very good examples, but I can say that we are way behind where we should be. And 2020 is, I think, will be very hot for us in terms of sustainability, because, you know, SDGs have a time limit. We want to be there by year 2030, so we don't have much time left. And definitely, I think in the next 10 years, we will be discussing these issues a lot, and especially in countries like us, who will definitely need a lot of capital inflows, and other emerging markets, of course, as well. And investors, as we observe, are becoming more and more demanding each day. And we are an unlucky generation, I think, because we don't have the chance anymore to pass the check to the next generations. I think we are now at a limit, and in terms of sustainability and reaching the SDGs, we might be the last generation to cope with this problem. Otherwise, I think we will be facing a lot of Greta Thunbergs. I mean, I think their number will rise exponentially in the next 20 years. And as the financial sector, I think we should be pioneering in these kind of subjects, because we need to rebuild, I think, our reputation, and we need to, I think, re-understand our real role in the real economy. So I think we should definitely move from these things are good to have to these things are part of our process. So with this maybe short introduction, the way I want to do it is start from the Far East, from Tokyo, and then come to Hong Kong, and then to Mumbai, and then fly to Canada. This is the, I think, order I made, so that Ian can have some rest as well, because he's been actually participating in all these panels. And the way we want to discuss this subject is that first we will hear from our participants their own experience in their own regions and in their own industries. And then we will discuss a bit about how the world will cope with these issues in the next 10 years. So let's start with Koichi Ishikura. And Koichi-san, would you please tell us What are your initiatives in Japan in reaching the SDGs? And maybe while you're telling these, you can maybe talk about later on what kind of challenges you're facing in doing your work. Of course, different parts of the world might have different issues. In Japan, maybe poverty is not really top on the agenda, but there might be some other issues like gender equality and things like this. Maybe you can talk about these, and it would be great to hear maybe a couple of stewardship examples and other things as well.
Okay, first of all, thank you for letting me join this panel discussion. As you know, Tokyo will host the Olympic and Paralympic Games in July to September next year. One of the important concepts of this forthcoming event is sustainability. Under this concept, some projects are ongoing. For example, 5,000 gold, silver, and bronze medals will be produced utilizing metals recycled from small electric devices, such as used mobile phones from all over Japan. The necessary amount of metals of this process has already been procured. Also, podiums used for the award ceremonies will be produced from waste plastics. Furthermore, Tokyo 2020 Games aim to be operated under the vision of diversity and inclusion, with every person being accepted and respected, no matter their age, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, religious beliefs, or intellectual or physical impairment. As indicated by the concepts of the Olympic and Paralympic Games, people's awareness of sustainability has clearly been heightened, and it is unsurprising that the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, have achieved worldwide attention. In the business world and financial market, this momentum has become visible as a rise in ESG consciousness. The Japanese institutional investors and the financial industry are well aware of these realities, find great potential for the SDGs, and are driving the momentum for the SDGs in Japan. Under this circumstance, the government and the industry have taken some initiatives. First, the Ministry of the Environment, MOE, published in 2017 its Green Bond Guidelines, which are in line with the ICMA's principles. Also, the MOE has been providing a subsidy system to enhance green bond issuance since 2018. Subsidies in the form of grants up to almost $500,000 per issuance are available mainly for expenses to undergo external reviews which confirm compliance with established standards like the ICMA's Green Bond Principles. And second, Japan FSA, Japan Financial Services Agency, which is the financial regulator in Japan, introduced the Japanese versions of the Stewardship Code and Corporate Governance Code in 2014 and 2015, respectively. These two codes have raised the awareness of ESG in both listed companies and institutional investors and have become a driving force for sustainable investment. And the third, JPX, Japan Exchange Group, launched a dedicated platform on its official website for both green and social bonds. The platform is a part of its professional-oriented bond market, Tokyo Pro Bond Market. As of today, 4 social bonds issued by Japan International Cooperation Agency, or JICA, have been posted on the platform. Also, a number of ESG-related ETFs are listed on the JPX, and JPX has developed ESG indices collaborating with outside benchmark administrators, including S&P. And fourth, the Government Pension Investment Fund, GPIF, which is the world's largest pension fund, became a signatory of the Principles for Responsible Investment, PRI, which is a voluntary and aspirational set of investment principles that offer a menu of possible actions for incorporating ESG issues into investment practice. The GPIF also selected 3 ESG indices for Japanese equities and commenced passive investment tracking those indices. And JSDA, my association, has also launched a number of initiatives to contribute to the achievement of the United Nations SDGs. While our initiatives cover a wide range of areas intended by the SDGs, I will introduce here 3 activities we are recently tackling. The first one is promote sustainable finance through our member firms' business activities. Last month, JSDA co-hosted with the ICMA in Tokyo a conference titled Developments in Green, Social and Sustainability Bond Markets in Japan and Asia. The conference gathered 700 participants. This number of participants is quite high for a single theme-focused event, which apparently evidences the rapidly rising interest in sustainable finance, including these bonds in Japan. In this field, JSDA conducted some more activities for the dissemination and promotion of these financial instruments in order to improve investors, particularly retail investors' understanding of bonds contributing to the SDGs. JSDA and the industry introduced the name of SDG bonds as an umbrella term for SDG-related bonds, including green, social, and sustainability bonds. Also, JSDA published the guidebook on financial instruments contributing to the SDGs, which is mainly for officers and employees of securities firms to deepen their understanding of the SDGs. The second initiative relates to gender issues. Within the SDGs, inclusive and sustainable economic growth is linked with the promotion of productive employment and decent work for all. The securities industry in Japan employs about 90,000 executives and employees. Therefore, if the industry endeavors to promote working reforms, particularly through addressing gender inequality, it has the potential to contribute greatly to the improvement of working conditions in Japan. To address these challenges, the JSDA began a series of measures, most notable of which is the Women's Network for the securities industry. In order to enhance the envisioned career path of women working in the securities industry, the JSDA established a network that connects such women, and within it facilitated dialogue on how to further the activity of women in the securities industry, drawing upon the personal experiences of each female employee. The participants of the network not only shared their own stories, but also conducted insightful discussions about the current challenges faced for women in the securities industry, as well as a possible way to tackle them. The third and the last one is to support the socially vulnerable. JSDA launched a framework for this purpose, leveraging the Shareholders Incentives Scheme. Shareholders incentives are commonly used in listed companies in Japan. In the scheme, a listed company gives its products or services as a privilege to its shareholders who own a certain proportion of outstanding shares of the company. GSDA sought a way of contributing to SDGs by leveraging this scheme and thus set up the Shareholders Incentives Endowment Fund for the SDGs. Under this framework, donations are made by each shareholder's decision. If a shareholder selects the option of contributing to the fund, the issuer contributes to the fund the equivalent amount that products or services are converted into cash. This framework also works for JSDA member firms, many of which own stocks of listed companies providing shareholders' incentives. So they are also encouraged to donate funds and products that can receive through shareholders' incentives. For this year, the proceeds of the fund is donated to the United Nations World Food Programme, UNWFP. We hope that through these activities we can help realize the roles of the securities industry and capital markets are expected to play in the achievement of sustainable development and can raise the industry's reputation and confidence from the general public. Thank you.
Thank you, Koichi. There seems to be a lot of coordinated work, and maybe Turkey and Japan might be similar only in one thing, which is the women participation in labor force, and that's something that needs to be improved a lot. And just because you mentioned, I think Olympics might be a good platform to highlight the sustainability issues globally. If you remember, in 2013, Istanbul was racing with Tokyo to get the Olympic Games, and I mean, you had a glimpse of what would happen last Sunday if we got the Olympic Games to this city. I mean, you saw that there was a marathon, and it was great, and everything flew perfectly, I guess. So thank you very much. We can pass to our next guest. Let's go to Mushtaq. And can you tell us, I mean, what is on top on your agenda, especially in Hong Kong and in Asia Pacific in general? Because we know that there are a lot of maybe climate and environmental issues, and we all know that Hong Kong has itself some issues as well. So because of this, I understand that you're maybe focusing more on things like green bonds. And maybe you can talk about these.
Sure, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to allow me to speak to this forum. I know you all very well, but it's still an honor to be here on the panel with my distinguished panelists. So, as many of you know, ICMA is focused on the bond markets. We focus on the international bond markets, and it's because of our standard-setting work and our experience in working with the official sector and trying to improve market practice that we were invited to help to manage, serve as a secretariat for the Green Bond Principles 6 years ago. Yes, and the first edition of the Green Bond Principles was published in 2014. We now have the Social Bond Principles and the Sustainability Bond Guidelines. Now, I always have to be very careful to say that these are not written by ICMA, these are not drafted by ICMA. It's very much a market-led effort through an organization called the Green Bond and Social Bond Principles, where ICMA serves as the secretariat, and we help manage the governance of the process. But ultimately, the guidelines themselves are the product of leaders in the market. They are issuers, investors, and intermediaries in the market. So from its very humble beginnings in 2014, the Green Bond and Social Bond Principles have now become very influential in the market. And of course, the whole idea of sustainable finance has become very much mainstream. It used to be a rather niche, a rather fuzzy, a rather almost kind of specialist realm that wasn't really relevant to most real players in the market. And I remember having conversations, especially in Asia, 3 to 4, even 3 to 4 years ago, with your very hard-nosed DCM types or secondary bond traders, and they would just scoff at this. They would just say it's a sort of fringe trend that nobody's really going to care about. And then all of a sudden, 2 years later, these same people are coming back to me and telling me, do you have an hour to explain green bonds to me? My CEO really needs to know, and I'm supposed to be involved in it, right? So it's become very much a high-level strategic mainstream aspect of doing business globally, but also in Asia. And that's been very gratifying to see. So just to directly address your question, it's the actual growing pains of green and social bonds that have led to what our priorities are today in the region. Now, green and social bonds are very established as an asset class. However, the issuance volumes compared to the overall bond markets is still relatively small. This year, we're on track to have, I would say, about 200 to 225 billion US dollars globally in issuance of green bonds. Of course, this is not counting some of the other categories of sustainable finance or sustainable assets, but it's a good measure just to look at green bonds. And then when you look at the trillions and trillions of dollars in the actual bond markets, it's still just a drop in the bucket. So one big challenge is continued outreach and continuing to try to encourage more green bond issuance, because that green bond issuance is going to drive actual investment in environmentally friendly projects, which is absolutely necessary for building the infrastructure to have the impact on the environment that we're all looking for. It's very important to keep in mind what is our end goal. Our end goal is to mitigate the risks of climate change, is to have beneficial social outcomes. It's not just necessarily to issue more bonds, right? So we have to think about these things. And that leads me to my second point, which is a big issue for us now, which is measuring and ensuring the most efficient impact of green bonds. So again, 4 or 5 years ago, really the focus was getting the standards right? It was trying to make sure that the standards were not too generous, but not too strict, to allow the growth of the market. And there was a lot of work being done to make that very carefully calibrated to meet the needs of all market participants and to allow growth in the market. Then, over the last maybe couple of years, there's been a lot of emphasis on official sector activities in the market. China was a vanguard here. ASEAN has also been very important in setting regional standards, and Japan has been a big leader, even especially not only from the government side, but also from the private sector and the association side in helping to push the green bond market. So we've gotten to the point now where we have good standards, we have market growth, we are pushing for issuance, but we need to now translate that directly into actual impact and actual projects. And so there's a lot of technical work going on within ICMA and within the working groups under the Green Bond Principles and Social Bond Principles on how to measure impact accurately on the environmental level, but also on the social level. These are very challenging questions, but they're extremely important. And the reason they're important is not only so that we can ensure that the green bond market and social bond market have credibility, that they have additionality, so to speak, because that is one of the criticisms of the market, is that are these green bonds just refinancing projects that are already underway? The answer is generally no, but I also think that misses the point. Right? I think the part of the point of the green bond market is to have a signaling effect, to improve strategies in the market, to build awareness, and to encourage more types of sustainable investment. But ultimately, we have to look at the overall impact of that. And the second very practical reason why impact measurement is extremely important is that investors are starting to look at this on a portfolio level or on a global level. And that's not only because of their own internal risk measures, but also because of the demands of their end investors. And now increasingly there are regulatory pressures for investors to understand the impact, negative or positive, of their portfolio and the risks associated with climate. So if you just think about it very practically, if you're an investor and you have a green bond fund and you have a number of issuers in your portfolio, how are you going to aggregate all of the different impacts, environmental and social, for the investments in that portfolio, especially if the issuers are having different ways of measuring them. So it becomes very important to have common standards. It becomes very important to have common methodologies and credible methodologies so that you can have comparable measures across them. And then the final big focus area for ICMA now, and again, this is just I would say, a result of the success in a way of sustainable finance, is how to deal with the concept of transition. So many of you may have heard of this term being thrown around. It's a bit of a euphemism, but what transition necessarily means, or what transition bonds mean in practice, are green bonds, or sorry, let me say sustainable finance instruments that are contributing to a more sustainable society or planet or economy, but that may be issued by issuers that aren't quite there yet themselves in their own strategies, or investments in technologies, investments in projects that are on the pathway to sustainability, but not necessarily sustainable. So I'll give two concrete examples. I know that's a bit conceptual. So the stereotypical example of a transition bond issuer would be a fossil fuel issuer, right? So a lot of investors would feel, whatever the green bond principles say, that if a fossil fuel company is trying to issue green bonds to fund hydropower plants or something that's relatively clean, that still shouldn't be counted as green. This is not a unanimous view, but this is the view of many investors. However, some of those same investors, even though they might be uncomfortable with the idea of calling that a green bond, they might be comfortable with calling it a transition bond, because even though the issuer itself is not perfectly green, at least they're making an effort, at least they're going in the right direction. Right? So that's on the issuer side. The other way to look at transition bonds is more on the project side. So the example I would give here is, say, manufacturing of electric car batteries. Right? So again, if many issuers might look at this and say, well, manufacturing batteries, that involves mining, it involves rare earths, it involves polluting chemicals. It's not exactly a green industry. So maybe we shouldn't really be calling this a green project or a green investment. However, it is ultimately contributing to a greener economy by encouraging the use of electric vehicles as opposed to fossil fuel vehicles. So these are just a couple of examples, but there are many others. And the whole idea here is to allow the concept of sustainable finance to grow in order to bring in issuers and projects that are actually contributing, even though they may not be absolutely green. This is a very difficult question. There's a lot of controversy about this. Some investors in the market don't like the idea at all. Some investors and participants in the market just say these should be green bonds, right? Because they have positive impact and because they're on their way. So we're actually right in the middle of this discussion at ICMA, and we're working with the various stakeholders. What will probably come out of this, in a concrete sense, is guidance about the green bond principles and how they relate to the concepts of transition. So in other words, if you're an issuer who's a sort of transition issuer, or if you're an issuer that's looking at transition style projects, what we plan to do is keep the green bond principles and social bond principles the way they are, but help the market to interpret them against these examples of transition. Ultimately, we want to be very careful not to allow the concept of transition bonds to introduce the possibility of quote-unquote greenwashing. At the same time, we don't want to exclude projects and issuers that are potentially beneficial to the market and they're helping to solve the problems that we have.
Thank you, Mushtaq. I understand there are some conceptual issues to solve as well, especially on the transition side. So from here, we can go to Kamlesh. Kamlesh, while you're telling about your experience, maybe you can also talk a bit about where the pressure comes from. Does it come for you from the government, from the clients, or your international investors? And India is a big democracy. It's a developing country. are these sustainability issues seen as a threat in front of development, or are they seen as an opportunity?
Yeah, so I would just like to first thank ASF for giving this platform, and TCMA to kind of giving such a nice warm hospitality and a warm welcome. So thanks for that. And I have prepared a small presentation, a kind of a slide, what India has been doing. But before that, I would like to introduce that India by itself, from the heredity perspective, has something in the Sanskrit word says Kutumbasya. So basically what it means is, Vasudev Kutumbasya means that the world is a whole family. So basically, we've got this sustainability SDGs coming up sometimes in 2015, but this is something which is inherited and it's part of the culture which says that it's like one world. So going by that philosophy, India has been able to do a couple of remarkable achievements, which will come in the last slide. But to start with, the couple of ones that need attention, and the government is, as you just mentioned, is the government. Government is being very supportive, and this has been one of the prime things whereby government has gone ahead and said that we will give a voluntary report on a regular yearly basis. So the next one's going to be up in 2020, and a roadmap has been put up, what all areas that need to be tackled. So the first one, of course, as we have a large population base, poverty is something that is one of the major issues. So the number one is that no poverty should be there. And 2030 has been kept as the deadline. With that, almost in the 16-17, a data was taken where 2 billion person days of employment has been generated in 16-17 alone. So, so this is specifically from the disadvantaged sections of the society. And even each person, because they are poor, insurance have been doled out free by the government up to ₹1,00,000. So that comes to the second thing, that is good health and well-being. So with that, we have something called the Poshan Abhiyan, which caters specifically to undernourishment, malnutrition, and a specific budget which has been consistently rising since 2016. Right now, we are at almost 1.27 billion as we see it. And of course, the numbers have changed from the infant mortality rate, which used to be 57 in 2005-06, which is shown as 41, but its 2017 figures is at 32. So we've done a reasonably good job in terms of good health and well-being in that direction. Gender equality, as one of my participants mentioned, we too have something by the same similar name. It's called the Beti Bachao and Beti Padhao. So it's both, you save the girl child and you educate, because financial literacy is one of the most important aspects for SDGs to kind of move forward. Then we have, the next slide is, yeah. So it's clean water and sanitation. As you may be aware that we have a project which is the Ganga. Ganga is one of the biggest rivers in our India. So it's called the Namami Ganga project, which cleans the natural resources, and so as the Swachh Bharat mission, which infrastructure development and open defecations of free. So which was part of the total cleaning was supposed to be a 5 years plan, whereby by this October 2019, which is supposed to commensurate with the 150th birthday of Mahatma Gandhi, the project cost is roughly about 2 lakh crores. So as you would have noticed that the compensation for doing all of these works, consistently the government is increasing its budgets. Then is affordable and clean energy. Again, one of my colleagues just mentioned that energy, green energy is something that so we've launched a scheme which is FAME, faster adoption and manufacturing of electric vehicles. A couple of our top companies, which is, of course, Maruti Suzuki plus domestically Tata Motors, have gone ahead with this thing that from 2020 onwards, it's going to be, most of them vehicles will be BSI 6 and green energy conducive. Then we have climate action, which also has been looked into. Then sustainable cities. One more thing, that 100 smart cities, 100 smart cities were announced in 2000, which would be, in a way, to promote self-sustainability of the cities, which is where decent quality of life to all the citizens and a clean environment would be provided. So 99 smart cities are in the process of being, so that's an infrastructure boost that people are looking at. There are a few challenges as we have a larger population and a lot of people who are below the poverty line at this juncture. So investments required are quite large, and the gap is almost about 26 lakh crores, which is 366 billion based. So India basically would eventually, if you kind of look at it per day per person, it would work to every person in India would have to probably spend 140 rupees based on the dollar this thing. So $2 a day to kind of sustain development goals to go ahead. So this is versus if you make a comparative to the other economies, it would be approximately 1. So we need to work 2 times harder from that perspective. A few of the other pointers are that effectiveness of mobilizing fund in the picky investors, because when what we found is that when we go to investors for selling these bonds, etc., they're not too keen to kind of pick them up. Mainly so that government needs to intervene from that perspective to make them some kind of tax relief or maybe some subsidiary benefits. So that's something that we have tried and so then the advent of the green bonds, but it's still not developed. As we said, only 2 companies from the domestic have gone for the green bonds. 2 have gone globally, which is Adani and Green Toe. So these 2. And of course, lastly, measuring progress in this is one of the challenges. So it's not easily, like a one-on-one correlation that this is what's done and this is the progress because of what's been done. We go to the last one. So some remarkable achievements in terms of comparisons were made. So responsible consumption and production, which is the SDG 12, where India has taken the lead even for climate action and for partnership for goals, which is SDG 17. So these are some of the vital aspects from the government perspective that has been taken up. From the association perspective, what we are trying to look at is kind of financial literacy, because what we have noticed that most of the top level companies, so the big corporates, even we've got a listed universe of listed companies of almost about 6,000. And of which maybe the first 100 to 500 understand what the SDG in the full form is and what the real essence of SDG is. So I guess that, and the retail is practically out. So what needs to be done from the association perspective is to have a lot more literacy, a lot more seminars at least, so that, and we've almost about 6 lakh villages. So this can be, by the association, taken all over, so that kind of literacy can be spread to the retail people who are part of it. Even something like an index is what we are looking at. We have an index which takes care between what is the measurability of the work done by the states to the center. So that index we do have for most of the SDGs which are part of it. But an index which could have companies which are issuing these green bonds could also be one of the major aspects. So that now, as an investor, I would know that in this index, these are 30 companies which are trying to invest in the SDGs. And if someone wants to kind of support those, then the investor knows this is the index that I need to buy or sell. So maybe that's another way of looking at having a green index. So So as an association, we are trying to work with the government and try to see that where financial literacy or some new products or any of these things can be looked at.
Thank you, Kamlesh. I think India can be a good example, especially for emerging markets. And, from there, we can now hear from Ian a bit how the culture has evolved in Canada, maybe in terms of sustainability. And I guess you're also facing a lot of pressure from clients, not only from government, talking about the high, maybe financial literacy and things like that.
Yeah. Yes, Salim. Well, I thought by talking a bit about the Canadian experience, a lot of what's happening in Canada would resonate in your own countries. So I'm talking at it more from the experience of the players in the Canadian market. And in the context of doing that, using some of the fundamental information that was provided quite admirably by my colleagues, in particular Mushtaq, who talked about some of the real fundamentals and challenges in the market and the fundamental framework of the green bond market. But in the Canadian context, this really wasn't sustainable finance, as Mushtaq had said, was not really on the Canadian context, conscience, even after we signed the Paris Accords. It was something that was just not front and center, never mind with the general public, but certainly with the financial community. But over the last 2 or 3 years, it has changed. And I think first and foremost because of the very significant commitment that Canada made and the impact that potentially would have on the economy, and the need to recognize that we had not just to get that meet those objectives, but we had to do them in the most efficient way possible. I think the watershed in the Canadian context was in late 2017, early 2018, where there was a committee formed on sustainable finance that was spearheaded by the government. So in response to a question somebody asked earlier, government is very much the driving force, certainly in the earlier stages of the development of a green, sustainable bond market in Canada. That working group had government participation, but also had regulators involved in it and market participants as well. And they reported, I think, with their report in June this year, the middle of 2019. Now, in the interim, there has been a fledgling market, the beginning of a green market, with very limited number of issuers in the market, and issues that were very focused on particular projects or initiatives, and tended to be more shorter-term financing in their approach. When you look at the aggregate, for example, in 2018, I think as Mushtaq mentioned, there's about $170 billion in issuance that year, of which Canadian issuers accounted for about 3%, some $5 billion in overall issuance, which is less than half of what probably should be in normal circumstances. So again, it was a very small and limited marketplace, and grasping with I guess the challenges in moving it up. I think that this working group recognized that the first step was to map out where the investment was really needed to make a difference. And in the Canadian context, the advantage was that, first of all, it's a small economy, but it's very heavily oriented to resources and oil sands development. There's been very poor capture of the CO2 emissions in the production of bitumen from the oil sands in Alberta. So there was recognition right away that there needed to be, there was significant opportunity to meet the commitments even in that sector alone, but it would require significant investment. So it was looked at as the first step in the process. What was also recognized as an important fundamental building block in the green market was you had to leverage on the Canadian capital markets. The capital markets in Canada, both the equity markets and the debt markets, are fairly deep and quite sophisticated. So the view was that we certainly needed to leverage off that opportunity in the markets. And I think what was recognized as well, and is still in the early stages, is you needed to provide a series of incentives and opportunities, or incentives in particular, to issuers and investors to encourage both the issuance of green bonds and investors to purchase the green bonds. Then the two key components of that, which have started and are underway, are the needed climate-related disclosures on the particular bonds, particularly in terms of the use of the proceeds, the management of the process of the proceeds through continuous and ongoing disclosure to investors, which comes back to a point that Mushtaq made, so that you do have a well-informed investing public in terms of the ability of these particular bonds to be meeting the objectives to which they were intended. The other major component that is underway, again building on recent experience, is the needed taxonomies or definitions. This, in effect, is relating the disclosures to the impact that these bonds are having, and it's probably one of the most important aspects of the green bonds themselves, is measuring the impact that they have on the end result in terms of achieving the kind of reduced emissions that are necessary in the marketplace. And what is happening in the Canadian context, and something I'd like to explore a bit with the panel, is that now you have basically second parties out there in the market. In the North American Canadian context, it's Sustainable Analytics and Cicero, and there's another, CBI, the Climate Bond Initiative, that actually provides the tools or assessment of the impacts that the green bonds have in the marketplace. And ancillary to that, it was felt by the working group, the two areas that they needed to focus on as well, somewhat related to the green bonds, was a Canadian Centre for Climate Information. In other words, better information on how the climate was changing in the context of these green bonds. So to get good information on climate change, improvement, deterioration, whatever. And the other area that was a focus was a more belated recognition that climate-related issues can have serious consequences, risk consequences. These are climate-related risks to financial issuers and holders of securities because of climate consequences. I guess the final major point in this work as a recommendation was, and it's been talked about here, it's a need to broaden the understanding of the players in the marketplace, which is the importance of these green bond initiatives, the investment initiatives that are necessary to reduce carbon emissions, focusing on the issuers, and also in the context of the awareness campaign with the issuers, is to provide financial incentives to issuers to engage in greenfields investment and additional investments on maybe existing plant for, again, to meet these green bond targets, and from the point of view of investors, to make investors more aware, to encourage them to be investing in the bonds, and to provide certain incentives to encourage their participation in the market. This could be exemptions on interest paid on green bonds, or some other kind of tax incentive to retail investors. And with the institutional investors, in addition to the awareness of investing in green bonds, is to focus on creating what my colleague Kamlesh has talked about, which is creating indexes of green bonds to facilitate the tracking of performance and the measuring of market performance of green bonds. So there's been a wide range of recommendations that are put forward, and it's being done in the context of a moving market where there has been green bond issuance, not a lot, and varied and more issue-specific, but I think a process to set a foundation in place to build on that market and to push towards a more robust, expanding market in the Canadian marketplace to enable Canada to meet its environmental objectives.
Thank you, Ian. Just because we have some time limit, I was planning to have a second round, but instead of doing this, I want to actually go directly to the question and answer section, but I will ask the first question, which will be the subject of the second round. So maybe whoever wants to take a shot on this, I mean, that would be perfect. Well, the question is, I mean, as the SDGs say, that no one should be left behind. So the whole world should reach these targets by the year 2030. How feasible is this target when you consider the current, global social and economic situation? So we know that U.S. has withdrawn from the Paris Act, for example, and there are challenges like this. There are still a lot of discussions around global warming, and when we have such a challenging environment, how feasible do you think that SDG targets are going forward?
I'll just take a quick stab at the answer. I think the technical issues that are confronted in the Canadian market, and it's one of the lagging markets, in terms of putting in place the technical features of the marketplace, which are the underlying disclosure requirements, dealing with what the fundamental principles should be to build a market, and then the taxonomy itself. I think we'll overcome that fairly quickly. I'd be interested in Mushtag's take on that. But the reason why I say that is we've adopted, and the market has in Canada, the ICMA Green Bond Principles. They're well understood. They're well followed in terms of moving out into the impact and having criteria to measure impact analysis. There's a lot of participants in the market. Moody's would be another one that's participating in the green markets, green bond markets in Canada, the U.S. So there's a lot of entities participating in it. The regulators are participating from a disclosure point of view. It seems to me that they will coalesce around more common standards, and that may happen more quickly than slowly. I think the bigger challenge, certainly in the Canadian context, is the awareness issue with investors and particularly institutional investors and retail as well, and also with issuers to push them into more active investment in this area. That probably is going to be difficult, and I think there is a risk that Canada is not going to be able to achieve the kind of investment targets.
And this is where associations can play a role, I think. Kamlesh, you were going to...
Yeah, so I think it's a fairly ambitious target, but at the same time, because why I say this is the way things are, we've taken almost about 5 years to get a reasonable idea of what SDG is all about. At the same time, only a couple of companies who've actually kind of gone ahead and got themselves some money for the same. India, from a perspective of the type of outlays that it would have, will mean that we need to grow at some X%, which is 8+. Considering the current scenario, maybe it could be a little ambitious is what I would look at. But yes, it's doable. Maybe specifically, as Ayan just mentioned, that, and even Mushtaq, that what's happening here is that the government is in the driver's seat, and the government actually wants to go ahead to implement most of the stuff. So what happens is that if there is pockets of financial literacy and if there is awareness which has been spreaded all over, it becomes a much faster process. So first, and as we always look, most corporates have the first 5 years which are difficult in a way, and then things kind of smoothen out and it's simpler. So I'm reasonably optimistic, but yeah, there are challenges. Back in most countries also, there are issues of NPAs. There are issues of NBFCs having some kind of defaults, etc. So all these will also be detrimental to the growth because it's sustainability at the overall picture. So I guess it's going to be difficult, but I think we'll get there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have to establish that sustainability is actually for the benefit of investors. It's for sustainable returns. It's not an environmental activity or something.
Yeah.
Koichi?
Yes, I'm not sure I can directly reply to your questions, but regarding your questions, I'd like to touch upon the difference among jurisdictions and regions in achieving the SDGs, which also relates to transition issues that Mushtaq mentioned. So I'd like to dare to touch upon the sensitive issue in addressing climate change. Tackling climate change is a monumental challenge now placed high on the global agenda. And most global policymakers are doing their best to coordinate their approaches in addressing this issue. The financial sector is also expected to effectively contribute to the achievement of the policy objectives. ESG considerations in finance are expected to facilitate the flow of necessary funds to eco projects and give proper incentives to improve corporate environmental consciousness. In the process of aiming at a lower or zero carbon society, how to address projects like clean coal or products like gas electric hybrid cars is not an easy question. These projects and products reduce but do not eradicate CO2 emissions. While various arguments that surround this issue are currently ongoing, some major financial institutions have announced outright that they would quit financing coal-fired power stations. If I may express my personal and frank view, this is not an official view of GSDA, but I wonder if financing for lower carbon projects or products should be immediately stopped writ large. I doubt that. A good percentage of the global population still relies on electricity generated from fossil fuel power plants. In India and China, coal-generated electricity accounts for 75% and 70%, respectively, of total electric power generation. In Japan as well, a considerable proportion of electricity is being produced from fossil fuel power plants. Also, a vast number of gas and diesel-fueled cars are running around all over the world, particularly in emerging countries. Given this reality, perhaps it could be said that projects that considerably improve fuel efficiency while not necessarily achieving zero CO2 emissions may still be worth financing and implementing. Lower carbon projects still have the potential to make huge impacts to reducing the global carbon footprint, even if they are not zero. To this extent, I think we need to aim at realizing a zero carbon society in stages, whilst maintaining a proper level of economic activity and people's living standards. I also think that we should pay due attention to the different economic situations and diverse social circumstances in each jurisdiction and region in achieving the SDGs, including environmental objectives. So, in order to create and nurture a culture of ESG consciousness that is seen as a necessity rather than an option, I think it is important to realize that all jurisdictions are at different stages in their development, and that it is in some sense unfair to ask of certain jurisdictions to adopt SDG-related initiatives in the way that developed markets are used to. We are all at different chapters, perhaps, but we need to make sure that we are all part of the same story, one that leads to sustainability in the long term. So moving from chapter 1 to chapter 2 is still a step in the right direction, so to speak. And there I say that we should be cognizant of this reality. This is my opinion.
Thank you, Koichi-san. Any last words?
Sure, I'll speak on this for a bit. And I really do appreciate Ishikura-san's candor and frankness. I think we need a little bit more of that sometimes here. And I might be a little bit of the same, a little bit off-piste from ICMA official doctrine. So please forgive me for that and don't tell the press. I think that your question is absolutely crucial, and that's really the fundamental question: is how do we get to the SDG? How do we get to the goals in the SDGs, or how do we get to the SDGs? And how can the financial industry, the securities industry, best contribute to that? So, but when looking at the bigger question, I think it's important, at least personally, to make sure that we distinguish between those aspects that are, in some sense, under our control, how the financial industry can contribute, and larger issues that might, in some ways, be outside of the remit or not necessarily within the full control of the financial industry. So, what I mean is, if you looking at the more narrow types of questions, this is building the sustainable finance market, right? These are things that we as associations are doing every day to build standards, to educate the markets, to encourage investors, to encourage issuers, to work with regulators, to provide incentives, to provide adequate regulatory frameworks, disclosure frameworks, really just to make sure, and impact measurements as well, to ensure that the financial regulatory system is correct, to ensure that the standards are correct, to ensure that there is, I think it's necessary to have a balance between harmonization and experimentation and diversity of standards and of approaches country by country. I think you need a little bit of both, and we at ICMA have quite a lot of experience sort of trying to figure out the right mix of getting things consistent so you get more efficiency, but also allowing for innovation and adaptability to different markets. So I think on that level, on the financial industry level, we've made a lot of progress, but it's still slower than it needs to be, I think. I think if we look at the amount of investment needed, the trillions of dollars of investment that are needed in sustainable projects, and the relatively small volumes of green and social SDG bond issuance, there's an enormous gap, and that gap is not going to be filled by public money. It's only going to be filled by private money, private investment. And so I think there does need to be more urgency to actually build those markets. And I think we've made a lot of progress, but we have a lot more work to do. Now, looking at it more broadly, this is where I might get a little bit controversial, but retaining the Sustainable Development Goals, it's going to require bigger changes in regulations and lifestyle and national policy. I mean, of course, you can look at what's happening with the Paris Agreement and the American government. That's absolutely not positive in my personal view. And I think it's obviously going to be negative for the world attaining the SDGs. But I think it's all too easy to just focus on America's misbehavior, as terrible as it may be, on the environmental level, at least at the national, federal level, and forget that even in Asia Pacific, there are a lot of national policies that are discouraging progress towards the SDGs. I mean, I'll just give a couple of examples. I mean, we all know that there's a major sovereign fossil fuel company in the region about to have an IPO that's going to attract $1.2 trillion of investment, right? And this is oil, right? So, and this is going to be a decades-long investment in fossil fuels that the industry is actively encouraging. And actively encouraging because there are incentives, because there are fiduciary duties. It's not that people are evil, but it's people are following the rules and the incentives and the guidelines that they have to follow for their own investors and their own clients. And until the overall rules change, then I think this will continue and inhibit progress on the SDGs. And even in Asia, we look at a lot of the infrastructure investment that is not necessarily green, that involves building infrastructure that is polluting, that is destroying the environment, that may not have good social side effects. And to be fair, a lot of this infrastructure is also in service of the SDGs, right? So we're looking at building cities, building networks of transportation, building opportunities for jobs. Sometimes we have to think about the very difficult questions where progress in one SDG might have a negative implication on other aspects of SDGs. So you have to make those balances and make those sacrifices. And so I think we have a lot of hard questions in Asia on that level as well. So I'll stop there, but I do think that we definitely have to look at our own neighborhood as well. I'll be the first to criticize the United States government, but I think we can also think about what we can do more.
Thank you very much. Of course, it's a huge subject, and
I think we don't have time for any questions.
Oh, no.
Because we're behind the schedule, so if you could please wrap up.
Okay, then thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists for this very informative panel. So could you please proceed to the stage now for the group photo? And then you can go out for the coffee break, but please be back not in 15 minutes, but maybe 5 minutes or something, because we have a full schedule to follow up.